What are called near-death experiences can happen under a variety of extreme circumstances. That in his NDE, he got what he had been searching for all his life. He was left alone. It is a particular kind of hell. Getting into, like, why do people even have NDEs?
You read, get out of my head. I was about to ask you that question.
When people have a near-death experience, they almost always leave organized religion. And he said, today I am a different person than I was 5 years ago. And he said, nothing short of that experience would have transformed me. A lot of NDErs can't wear watches afterwards because the battery dies.
I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Jan Holden. How you doing, Jan?
I'm good. Thanks very much, Alex.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for making it out here to Next Level Soul Studios. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it worked out well.
Yes. So you have been studying near-death experiences for like a year or two, right?
Just a year or two. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Since the mid-1980s.
Since in the 1980s, when it was cool to be studying NDEs.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I can only imagine from the 1980s. I mean, I think Dr. Raymond Moody, he released that pinnacle book, or the seminal book, in the 70s, like 75?
That's right.
Somewhere around there, right? And he's the one who coined the phrase near-death experience. Right. But between that book and the 80s, it's still very brand new. The concept of go to the light, all that stuff that's in the zeitgeist now.
That's right.
Was not. What kind of attracted you to this, first of all, weird, at that time, extremely weird and woo-woo space?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had, first of all, just growing up, I was always interested in phenomena that were difficult to explain. And I grew up in the more liberal branch of the Lutheran Church, so I was, raised in religion. And then in 1978, I read Moody's book. And it really captured my imagination, especially the phenomenon of veridical perception, where when people are in this near-death experience and they experience their consciousness functioning apart from their body, and they perceive things in the material world or the transmaterial world that involve information that they couldn't have known from any normal means.
Yeah.
But then is confirmed as accurate. Mm-hmm. It's like not only is the experience subjectively very real, people will sometimes say that it was realer than this reality, but that there was evidence for objective reality of the experience. So that just kind of sat in my mind. And then in the mid-1980s, I was finishing my doctoral degree in counselor education, and had to do a dissertation. And long story short, I ended up doing it on something related to near-death experiences. And, a lot of people, when they do a dissertation, by the time they're done with it, they never want to see the subject again because it just, it was so grueling. But I was absolutely hooked. And even today, in the International Association for Near-Death Studies, members receive in their email box a monthly NDE, where one of our volunteers goes through our archive of NDE narratives and finds one that is of particular interest for some reason or another, and then sends it out to the membership. And even today, after I've, heard, read, interviewed, like probably thousands of near-death experiencers, I just almost always drop everything and to read that yet another account of a near-death experience. It's just endlessly fascinating to me.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So when you have been, you've done thousands of interviews or read thousands. You've done so many different, you're deep in this, as they say.
Yeah, I'm deep into it.
You're deep into it. What is the most, I know this is a hard question, what is the most profound one that really sticks out in your head? You're like, oh my God. Because out of the, when you first read the first one or you hear a first one, you're like, oh my God. But after 1,000, they start to melt together. Mm-hmm. So there's like this ocean of many of them. And for me, I've done 120, maybe 130 interviews. There's few that will start to rise above the rest, not because I'm diminishing the rest, but they just have either a uniqueness to it, there's a connection to it, the energy, the heartfelt, what happened to them, loss of family, or who they met on the other side, or the lessons they brought back. What was that for you? Is there one that really connected?
I really can't choose one.
Does any pop to your mind?
But some of the ones that I think are most potentially influential to people who are wondering, like, is this for real, are like Dr. Mary Neal. Have you interviewed her?
Oh, yeah, I love her. She is a force of nature.
She is. And as I love when she says, I'm not an imaginative person, so I could not have made this up.
Right.
And because she's a physician, physicians are among the most trusted profession. And so to hear a physician talk about the kinds of things she experienced and learning that her son Willie was going to die before his 18th birthday, when he was only, I think, 5 at the time of her NDE, just a lot of aspects that she experienced, just very, very convincing. And also that her NDE occurred when her body was underwater, and they now have figured out that she was underwater for just a little over 30 minutes. So she was dead, and then to have this vivid experience that had these veridical components like Willie's passing and so forth, I think it's very influential for people who are really wondering, what can I really believe in these phenomena?
Right, and there's not just one or two of them. There are, at this point, tens of thousands of them have been recorded.
Right. Yeah.
What is the longest time someone's been out? In your record?
I don't know, but I
30
think
minutes is a long time.
30 minutes is a long time, and I think Mary's is among the longest. There have been cases of people whose bodies actually were brought to the morgue, and then their bodies in a bag, and someone sees a little bit of movement, and so I know George Rodinaya, who's now passed, he's a Russian guy, had that experience. So there have been a few where the people have been without any cardiac activity for many minutes.
There was one that I heard that I don't know if you've heard this one or not, but the person had the woman had died. She was in the morgue, and her brother came to recognize the body, to identify the body, and I think it must have been at least a 10-hour window. I mean, it was a while. And when he came in, he was looking at her, and he noticed that tears were coming down her eyes. From her point of view, she says she was in the body, but the body, it was taking time to restart. Like everything, it was like rigor mortis had started set in. I mean, this is an extreme version.
It is.
And then that he goes, Doc, is this normal? Do corpses cry? And she said, no. And they started to work on her right away and got her engine running again, got the blood flowing again. It was fascinating. Yeah. But I've heard those like really long, and they've been hours, 90 minutes, 2 hours. So for people to understand that, I mean, you're supposedly after 7 minutes, you're done.
Yeah.
You're a vegetable.
Yeah.
You're never coming back.
Yeah.
And there's documented case after documented case after documented case that this is pretty remarkable.
It really is. And then for also that when people have been gone that long, if they do recover, they usually have no normal functioning. They might just be in a coma or something. And to have perfect healing and everything come back. I think too of Anita Morjani.
Of course. Yeah.
And have you had a chance to interview her?
She's going to be coming back. I think next week actually.
Wonderful,
I
wonderful.
love her.
Yeah,
her story is extremely special because of the healing aspect.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about that?
Well, just that she was in end-stage lymphoma, and in a coma. She had lumps all over her neck area and lesions all over her body, and her organs were shutting down. And the medical professionals absolutely expected her to die.
Yes, they should.
And one of my favorite aspects of her experience that I haven't heard in any other experience, near the end, she's with, I believe, her father and her deceased father, and they're in the hospital room looking on the situation and, seeing her body down there. And her father says to her, it's time for you to decide if you're going to stay here or go back into that body. And she's like, how could I go back into that body? It is so wasted. And she said, plus, didn't a nurse just come and draw blood? And that blood test is going to show whether my organs are continuing to shut down and or not. And her father said to her, what you decide right now is going to determine the outcome of that blood test.
Wow.
We normally think a blood test, the blood's there, the answer is in the blood, it's written in stone, but that some aspect of our will, our whatever, can influence the physical world.
Well, even something is something that is stone. Stone is still not stone.
Yeah, yeah.
It's still something. It's molecules. It's movable. You technically should be able to put your hand through it because on a quantum level, you should.
That's right. That's right. And that manifests in spoon bending, which I teach a course at the University of North Texas for counseling students on the transpersonal perspective in counseling. And I start the course with a movie called Something Unknown is Doing We Don't Know What, which is a great movie that's available online for anybody who's interested. It's a 90-minute movie about the evidence for paranormal phenomena. And in it, they show spoon bending, and some of my students get inspired and try it at home. And then a few of them have come to class with their bent spoons and said, that and then, of course, what we talk about is, what was happening when the metal became like rubber and you could just, bend it and twist it and that sort of thing.
It's if I come from the film industry, so I always have movies in the back of my head, and the one scene that comes to my mind when you're saying this is in the movie The Matrix, when Neo is visiting the Oracle and he sees a bunch of little kid monks, and they're playing with spoons, bending the spoons. And this profound statement, he's like, how do you do that? He goes, the question is not how you do it, but I think it was like, and I'm massacring it, but I think it was like, the real question is that even a spoon? Is it even exist? Once you understand that, then you can bend it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you understand then the nature of reality.
The plasticity of reality. Exactly.
It's fascinating.
It is.
Now, one thing that I've always been fascinated about with near-death experiences is the people, quote-unquote people, entities, beings that show up, from relatives to deities to angels to animals and so on. I always joke that Jesus is the hardest working man in show business because he tends to show up at all of them. Yeah. My absolute favorite Jesus NDE story ever is there was an atheist, hardcore atheist, who died. And when he goes to the other side, Jesus is there, and he's wearing a suit with his hair pulled back. And he goes, and he knew what Jesus was, but he didn't believe in him. He goes, Jesus? Is it Jesus? He goes, yes. He goes, why are you dressed in a suit? He goes, it's the only way you would take me seriously.
Exactly.
Which I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, NDEs, at least the stories that I've seen, and especially a lot of the people I've spoken to, are much more from the Western side of the world, not meaning the East. So how many near-death experiences have you encountered from India, from Africa, from, Aboriginal, native near-death experiences, as opposed to kind of the Raymond Moody story that I'm sure there's overlap, but that's the story that we always hear. And I always get asked, well, what about, why is Jesus always there? But Shiva's showing up, and so has Buddha and so many others. Yeah. But I'm curious, what's your experience?
Yeah. We now have collected lots of NDEs from non-Western cultures. And one of the best sources to read those is on the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation website, which is Jeff and Jody Long's website. Anybody interested can just go to nderf.org. org.
Yeah.
Have you interviewed
Twice.
him? Oh, wonderful!
Yeah,
Yeah,
Dr. Long's amazing.
Yeah. And so, so people can actually read, because they've translated a lot of them from the original language to English. So we can actually read non-Western NDEs. And the scholar who has most studied these is Gregory Shushan.
I've had him on the
You've
show.
had him too.
Yes, yeah.
So, he has collected, and I don't know how he does what he does. He finds these most remote near-death experiences in these hidden away documents that it's just amazing. So we have them not only from other cultures, but from ancient history as well.
Yeah, I was going to get a question. What's the oldest recorded NDE? Is that ancient Greece?
I think it's some. I can't remember. It's something that I made a note of the last time I talked with Gregory, but
it's up there though. It's like in the ancient Greeks.
Ancient
Roman.
It's a BC kind of thing.
Oh yeah, so it's over 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
Because it makes sense to like, well, why haven't these near-death experiences been around all the time? Well, because people will have a heart attack, they die.
Right.
There was no CPR. There was no way to recover.
So rare.
Bring them back then. So it must have been a very rare experience.
Yeah, it was very rare, which is what makes his work so precious. And he and I have come to the same position independently. I use he doesn't use this concept, but I use the concept of deep and surface structures that comes from Noam Chomsky's work on linguistics, and the meaning that what he discovered is that children all over the world learn language in the same way. And that's because languages have a deep structure that's universal, but they're expressed in a surface structure that's the particular language of the culture. And so what I found is the same is true of near-death experiences. There are certain features that are broad, general features that you find across cultures and throughout history, but they manifest in a way that is reflective of the culture of the experiencer. And then beyond the cultural level, there's another one more surface structure level, which is personal. And so even within the same culture. So the example I use is one of these universal features is there's movement through space. And in the West, it's very common for people at some point in their NDE to talk about moving rapidly through a tunnel or some kind of enclosure, something like that. So that tends to be, it's not only in the West, but it's much more commonly reported in Western NDEs. So that's a cultural manifestation of movement. Now, just to take a minute to say, there's an example from a Maori woman, indigenous New Zealander, and in her NDE, she flew rapidly over Aotearoa, which is the indigenous name for New Zealand, to the jumping off place of souls. I'm sorry, it's the leaping off place of souls. So she flew over, and she talks about seeing all the rivers and things that she saw. So she didn't go through a tunnel, but she moved rapidly, through space. So back to the Western NDEs, moving through a tunnel seems to be a predominantly Western cultural expression of that universal theme of rapid movement through space. But if you hear three different people talk about the tunnel, you will not hear the same thing. Right. And so there's a little boy who was 5 years old, and he said, "Then I went really fast through a big noodle."
That was his reference point.
That was his reference point. A trucker said, then I zoomed through a giant tailpipe.
Sure.
And then another person who said, I went through this thing that had light, or it was dark and there was light at the end, and everybody describes the tunnel differently.
But yeah, exactly. So, and I like those three levels that you were talking about, because on that third level, the personal level, also is dictated by your belief system.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say, I wouldn't say dictated, I would say influenced by, because there also have been some great articles written about focusing on aspects of NDEs that not only were not anticipated by the NDEer, but directly contradicted their belief system.
Well, like Jesus in the suit.
Like, exactly. So,
Influenced by.
It's influenced by, yeah. And so we tend to see, perceive what we're prepared to perceive. And to my understanding too, it's kind of designed, it's a custom designed package for every single one. Yeah.
Because it's about making you feel comfortable for the most part. And we'll get into the negative ones later, but generally it's like, no, we want you to feel comfortable. That's why Grandma Nana's there, and your dog is there, and or your deity that you believed in is there to kind of walk you through, or an angel, or whatever that thing that makes you feel comfortable.
Yeah, help you adjust
to it's because it's a pretty abrupt, from this reality to that reality. It is definitely shaking you up. It's kind of like walking out of the water onto land.
Yeah,
It's
different.
It takes a minute to acclimate.
Yeah.
If you've been in water for 70 years.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say about that thing about Jesus. A few years ago, I did a little informal study. I never published this, but I was taken by how Jesus appeared different to different people.
All the time. Yeah.
And so I actually went to Jeff Long's website, NDERF, and pulled all the ones that I could find that referred to Jesus and then referred to a physical description of him, and then compared. And I think I found something like 18 or so, maybe more. And so in a nutshell, no two people described Jesus the same. He had brown hair, he had blonde hair. It was long, it was short. His eyes were blue, his eyes were brown, his eyes were piercing light. His voice was the lyrical music. His voice was the sound of a locomotive. And I got what I think was the key from two different NDEs, people who presumably didn't know each other, but in their NDEs, they reached a point, they were with a spiritual entity who said, "You're about to meet Jesus. How would you like him to appear?"
Right, yeah.
And it's that same theme, yeah. And so absolutely, I think there's a benevolent intent to help us adjust back to what people usually eventually realize they already knew. A place that felt familiar to them, but maybe not right at the beginning.
Yeah, and they're doing this even though they might know that you're going to go back.
Yes,
it's still
right.
Even we're going to play the game as if you're not going back, and then have you noticed that? I found that it's almost always a choice, but not always a choice to come back. Because sometimes it's just like, nope, you can't stay. Go.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right. So what I usually estimate that it's about a 50-50 proposition. About half of people are given a choice to come back. And when they decide to come back, it's virtually always because of a love connection on earth that they still need to do something for that person or fulfill something. And then the other half of people either are forced to come back against their will. And there's a really funny, I don't know if you've ever interviewed Kim Clark Sharp.
Yes,
but
Kimberly,
Kim Sharp, and she talks about how she got to the point where she was arguing with God and saying, I'm not going back. And yes, you're going back. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. And she says, and then she says, you see who won. So, but then there are also people who return just with no forewarning whatsoever. It's almost like they're in the middle of a movie and the projector goes off and they're just back in their body.
Right. It all depends.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, it all depends.
So you mentioned that you were raised Lutheran. I was raised Catholic. I'm a recovering Catholic, as I always like to joke. How has the field of near-death experiences affected religious beliefs around the world? Because it does throw a lot upside down from the Catholic point of view, and I'm assuming the Lutheran as well. this is not in the Bible. Well, technically, Jesus had a near-death experience.
Yeah. And so did Paul.
So did Paul, exactly. But generally, it's not talked about that this is the other side, or let's, God forbid, talk about past lives or karma or reincarnation. Right. None of that stuff. So there's a lot of ideas and concepts that are introduced in a near-death experience that go strongly against dogma of all religions around the world. Yeah. What's your experience with that? How is this kind of really affecting the world in general?
Yeah. Well, as you've undoubtedly observed, when people have a near-death experience, they almost always leave organized religion. Right. Not out of anger or, that sort of thing, but just because they discover that what they now know is too big for their religious doctrine to accommodate. And so they move on. And now I do know some NDErs who got more involved in their religion.
Yes.
I have a really good friend in Chicago who became a deacon in the Catholic Church after his NDE, but his first homily was about near-death experiences. So he was trying to bring it into the church.
I had an experience like that as well. I've had somebody here in studio who was a near-death experiencer, but they went harder into Catholicism or Christianity because Jesus was very predominant in their near-death experience, so really reinforced it. And I was kind of thinking about that. I'm like, okay, I wonder what the reasoning for that is, because you're right, most leave organized religion because it's just, when they see everything, it's too small. Yeah, it's too small. But then I was like, okay, so what's that soul's journey? It's like, oh, maybe his journey is to bring this into his flock and preach that way to kind of seed these ideas, because I have a lot of friends who are Mormon and who are deep into the Christian faith in whatever flavor you like, and they look at near-death experiences like, oh, cool. It's like an extra, oh yeah, that makes sense, until you start talking about reincarnation or past lives. Yeah. That's when it starts getting a little wonky for them. Yeah. But generally, like, oh, Jesus showed up. Oh, of course Jesus showed up.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. I also think that a person's own spiritual developmental level influences how they interpret even their own experience. And so, did they see Jesus, a concrete person, or did they meet with Christ consciousness that's a much more universal concept or phenomenon, but not recognize it as such yet or for now. So there are a lot of questions about interpretation there too.
What, from your experience doing research for as long as you have, what is the long-term effects of an NDE?
Yeah. So I like to talk about after effects as like PS after a letter. PS. So the first P is changes in psychological changes. And these include especially value changes. People become less materialistic, more concerned about others, and lose their fear of death because they now know that their consciousness is going to continue after their body's demise. And other kind of psychological changes. And then the first S stands for spiritual. People become more spiritual, usually less religious, but as we just said, not always, and become often like people will say, I just read one thing after another. I just had this hunger to immerse myself in spiritual books and movies and things like that. And also people develop what in some religious contexts are called spiritual gifts. So they develop the ability to see the future, and also things that are questionable in some religions, like the ability to communicate with deceased entities,
Become a medium.
people, yeah, like a medium or after death communication, which is after death is the direct communication with the person who it's for personal reasons, and then mediumship is where I communicate with a deceased person that I probably don't know,
my grandma,
for the purpose to communicate.
Okay, so that's a very distinct clarification I want to put there. Thank you for bringing that up, because mediumship is I can talk to the other side. Jan, your great-grandfather, he's here. He wants to talk to you. I don't know your great-grandfather.
Right.
That's a medium. But afterlife communication is I'm talking to my grandmother who I knew in this life and being able to talk to her, or my ex, or my wife. I've had people on the show that have a direct connection to their spouse, deceased, or their child. Yeah. That's afterlife communication. And that happens sometimes with a near-death experience, but also sometimes it happens without having to.
That's right. Yeah, and that's another whole area that I've done research in after death communication. So we could go off to that into that rabbit hole too. And then the next P is physical. And people, a lot of times after a near-death experience, people say that their metabolism changed, their need for sleep changed, their dietary preferences changed, and they become more sensitive a lot of times to not only environmental things like noise and visual things, but even medication, where they take a lot less to get the same effect that used to require more, and that sort of thing. And then another really interesting physical after effect is the electromagnetic after effects, where the person, especially when they become emotionally aroused, electronic things in their environment go kaflooey.
Because the field is getting that much more powerful?
Well, I mean, that's a good possible explanation for it. We don't know how to explain it yet exactly.
Did they bring back a little piece from the other side, I guess?
Yes. Well, I think it does change them. I mean, here we have to get into things that are beyond research. So this is opinion, not research.
Course, fair enough.
But apparently it changes their electromagnetic field, their energetic field. And so that when they're especially when they're emotionally aroused, it's an intensification of energy that has an effect on electronic things in their environments. So I had a near-death experiencer who I was actually interviewing her on recording it, and mentioned this after effect. And while we were sitting there, she's like, "Oh my gosh, that happens to me." And I said, well, and because I had started by saying, I notice you don't wear a watch, and a lot of NDErs can't wear watches afterwards because the battery dies. And they'll put a new battery in, and within a week that battery's dead, and they finally just give up. And she said, well, that started after my NDE, that I couldn't wear a watch anymore. And I said, well, have you noticed any other things? And she said, well, my boyfriend and I, they live together, just bought a TV. And he complains that when I'm in the room, nobody's touching the remote, and the TV volume will go up and down, and it'll switch channels just on its own. And he said it only happens when I'm in the room. And that's her electromagnetic after effect. People have had. I had she didn't have an NDE, but she'd had other transpersonal mystical experiences, and she was in a counseling session one day, and she was the client. She was talking about something very emotional, and in the lamp next to her, the light bulb exploded, and so people, lights dim and just all kinds of things. The scariest one I heard was somebody who was in a 2-seater airplane, and something started to go wrong, and the pilot was getting concerned, and the NDEer got really fearful, and all of the
instruments
went to zero.
That's not good.
That's not good.
That's not good in the plane.
So NDEers a lot of times have to learn how to, calm themselves, and she did. And the instruments came back, and of course they landed safely, or she wouldn't have been there to tell me the story. But it can be very inconvenient. There was an NDEer who worked in a medical lab, and they had noticed that whenever she walked into this one room that had a lot of electronic equipment, the equipment would go bad. So they bought a de-staticking thing for her to stand on, and she would go and stand on that for a half minute or a minute or so. And I don't know whether it was the de-staticking or the fact that when she stood there, she was just, getting kind of centered and everything, so that when she went into the room, she didn't create nearly as much trouble as she used to. So, so it can have, it's a really interesting effect. And we've researched it and know that it's a thing, and that it does happen when people are more emotionally aroused, which, people know that emotions are energetic. When we feel intensely angry or intensely depressed, there's an energetic intensity about that. And somehow that's manifesting.
With the after effects, what is your experience with psychic phenomenon?
Yeah, so that's back at the spiritual, where people develop like precognition, telepathy. A lot of NDErs after, I don't know if I should say a lot, but certainly a good number, after their NDE, it's like their boundaries between themselves and others and the world have kind of weakened. And
thinning of the veil.
And so a lot of NDErs can't go to parties because just being in a room with everybody with all their stuff, that they get affected by.
So they become empath. They become more empathetic.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
okay.
right. And sometimes have to spend some time withdrawing socially in order to build up their boundaries, their psychic boundaries again, and be able to manage social interaction. So it can be, a lot of us think, wouldn't it be wonderful to see the future or know what people are thinking? It's, we're given these boundaries, I think, for reasons that enable us to function in this world.
I've been reading comic books for most of my life, and these stories, I've learned the lessons from those characters. That you don't want those powers. You don't
want it. You don't. And
you really don't.
So an NDER was just telling me last week that she, after her NDE and she could see the future, she asked for it to stop because she really didn't want to know, because it was distracting, and
it changes the trajectory of your life. If you know when you're going to die, let's say I don't want to know my exit date or time or how. I don't want to know any of that.
Yeah.
Because if you did, it would absolutely change your life. It would change the trajectory of your life.
Exactly.
If I tell you have 2 weeks to live, those 2 weeks have changed dramatically if you didn't know that information.
That's right.
So it kind of goes against why we're here in the first place.
Exactly.
I have to ask you, because this is a question I get asked tons, and I'm sure you've had this question asked to you, with the rise of near-death experiences, especially as far as the reporting of them, especially in the last 5 years or so, it's gotten much bigger. I mean, it's exponentially growing. The knowledge, people knowing about near-death experiences, people coming forward with near-death experiences. How do you know when someone's just making up a story and when someone is actually telling their true story? Because it's the elephant in the room with a lot of this kind of stuff. And by the way, that goes for everybody on the show. With how do you really know she's a psychic? How do you really know he's a channel? But this is an interesting thing, because I mean, I've had a lot of people on the show, and I'm going to say most, if not all, I believed. But sometimes you just go, or the audience will just go, this is not feeling right. Yeah. So what's your experience with it?
Well, I think what you just said, that most people are sincere, and I think a real litmus test is that when somebody actually has to pay a price for coming out as a near-death experiencer.
Coming out of the closet.
Yeah, they're clearly not doing it for attention or to write a book and make money or anything like that. They're actually reluctant to come forward because they might professionally pay a price.
Oh, yeah.
And so when people like Mary Neal, or a book that I'm probably going to be writing with the leading NDE researcher, Bruce Grayson, is a collection of physicians' near-death experiences, because these are people who were schooled in materialism, believing that everything is physical and this anything spiritual is woo woo, and then they have their experience and they're transformed, and they have to have the courage to come out in a professional environment that's going to be hostile, not necessarily, but very, very likely hostile. And so we, why would that person do that if they hadn't genuinely had the experience they had that was so transformative?
I agree with you. There's a lot of doctors, scientists, engineers, people who are in hard sciences,
right?
That it's very difficult. I mean, if you were a tarot card reader and you had a near-death experience, coming out, not so much, not that big of a deal. But if you were in the Bible Belt as a doctor, I mean, I've heard these stories. It is so difficult to come out of, I call it coming out of the NDE closet.
Yeah.
Because some of them hold on to these stories for decades.
That's right.
And I asked a lot of them, I go, how do you deal with it psychologically? Just like if you're holding a deep, dark secret and you're carrying it with you, that's a weight. That is a baggage that you carry along, and you're not free until you finally come out. What are your experiences with that? Yeah,
well, much like yours, that it is, I call it spiritual constipation, because they really want to talk about the experience most of the time, sometimes not, but just don't feel safe that they're going to be believed, accepted, and so forth. And for some people, the experience is, for many people, it's so precious that to express it in a hostile environment, it's just so painful, and they just don't want to do it. So, but it's getting better.
Well, I mean, shows like this and other shows, and the work you're doing in IANDS is definitely made it normal. We're normalizing it. We're trying to normalize it as much. These conversations normalize this in a big, big way. One thing I've heard a lot too is the doctors at hospitals, when this stuff happens, probably not the best to talk to about this.
That's right.
But the nurses. The nurses are, as a general statement, I always like the nurses because they're in the weeds, they're in the trenches. They don't just come in for 5 minutes and leave. Sorry, docs. But they're really with the patient longer. And they see things that only someone who's there for hours and days can see. I had a story, one that an NDER came back, and the first person he saw was a nurse. And he had to say something. And he said, I don't know what just happened. I went to this place, and she's like, "Oh, darling, you just went to the other side and came back. It happens." And she's like, "This nurse has been doing it for 30 years or something like that." And she was so a matter of fact about it, because you see so much of it at a certain point as a professional. You just got to go, there's something here. It's something here. It's pretty interesting.
It is very interesting. And another aspect of NDEs that's really important to me is this phenomenon of veridical perception. That going back to your question about sincerity, that question comes up only if we're limiting ourselves to NDEs as a subjective experience. And certainly I've seen some people that I question too whether they're sincere, but they're very much a minority. But in addition, we can look at objective evidence for near-death experiences that then makes that sincerity question less important. Recently, IANDS has collected over 120 cases of veridical perception during near-death experiences, and it's in a book called "The Self Does Not Die." We're in our second edition now.
Nice.
And I would say for people who are questioning or just interested in, are these experiences for real? Reading, these are cases where there was verified paranormal phenomena during the near-death experience. So I'll give you some examples. One of my favorites is a person who was in surgery, went into cardiac arrest, and was when they resuscitated him, finished the surgery, and of course during this whole time, the person's completely anesthetized. Their eyes are taped shut and all that stuff that happens in surgery. And afterwards, he told his nurse that he was, during the surgery, he was outside of his body watching as they were resuscitating him. And he said that he saw his surgeon, who he recognized, flapping his arms as if trying to fly. And the nurse is like, okay. So this happened to happen at the University of Virginia, where, as I said, the leading researcher, Bruce Grayson, was on faculty at the time. And she knew he was an NDE researcher, so she called him and she said, you probably need to come over and talk to this guy. So Bruce went over. One of the reasons I like this one is because it happened right there. He, right away he was interviewing the person and was able to investigate the case. So indeed, the guy told him the same thing. He's like, my surgeon was flapping his arms. It looked like he was trying to fly or something. So Bruce is like, okay. And he didn't know this particular surgeon. So he found out from hospital records who all had been in the room. And he started with the kind of least person, like a technician, worked up through the nurses, and last point went to the physician. Everybody said the same thing, which the physician corroborated, but he also explained why. He had been trained internationally, and they were trained differently than in the U.S. And there, they were trained that once they sterilized their hands, they put them on their chest and on their sterile gown, and they would back into the operating room, and his assistants would be doing all the initial stuff, opening the patient and all that stuff. And then when the time came that his part came, then he would, do it. So while they're opening the patient goes into cardiac arrest. So he's saying, get that scalpel and move that thing over there and do this and do that. And he's pointing with his elbows. And to the patient, it looked like he was flapping his arms as if trying to fly.
That's amazing.
So this is what the kind of case that's very evidential, because it was investigated right away by somebody who knew how to investigate and be not
meticulous,
not lead people or that sort of thing. And it was information that was very idiosyncratic that nobody could have imagined. Who would ever imagine that their surgeon would be doing this? And so it's just very, very convincing that when the guy says his consciousness was out of his body, it really was, because his body was laying on the table, dead, with his eyes taped shut and a curtain over most of his body except just where his heart was. It was heart surgery. So, it's just so anyway, in this book, when you read one case after another, it's just very impactful. It was even though I provided all the cases that I had collected initially as the basis of this book, they added many more, and it's really turned into something much bigger than my little kernel of contribution. But even I, who have studied these, it was impactful to me to read them.
Yeah, so like Dr. Eden Alexander.
Yes.
He's a very, very famous one.
Yes.
Because he was a Harvard neurosurgeon.
Right.
And he had a very evidential
That's right.
thing that they corroborated and everything.
Yeah.
He actually had a brain virus or brain disease.
Yeah, he had meningitis.
Yeah, something that
was
basically your brain is absolutely gone.
He said his brain was, sorry to be graphic, but he said his brain was pus.
Yeah, it was like it basically, it was a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It was complete mush.
Yeah.
And yet he was able to come back of it.
Yeah, extreme and a very vivid experience at a time when, according to current neurosurgical or neurological theory, there should be no complex perception at all. And he had this complex, very intense experience while his brain was so offline. And the veridical part of his was that this attractive woman was with him on the butterfly wing as they were, and he later recognized that was his deceased biological sister, whom he had never met in physical life. And it was after his NDE that he became reunited with his biological family. His sister had already passed like 10 years before, but they showed him a picture of her, and he's like, oh my gosh, that's her. That was the woman who was with me. So, and that kind of thing is not uncommon. People perceive, one of the things I like to clarify about veridical perception is that it can be perception of the material world, like the surgeon, or it can be perception of the transmaterial world. People have met deceased loved ones who were not yet known in the physical world to have died. There's a case where a young, in fact, it's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the famous death psychologist, from the 1970s and so forth. Anyway, she was treating this boy who had, he and his brother and his mother had been in a car accident, and her patient had been brought to her hospital. The brother had been badly burned in the accident, had been brought to another hospital where they specialized in burn treatment, and the mother had died at the scene. So she's treating this boy. He comes in a coma and so forth, but then he regains consciousness. And she says, how are you? And he said, I'm fine. He said, my mother and brother are waiting for me. And she's kind of like, okay, sweetheart, And so then he loses consciousness, and a few minutes later he dies. So she finishes all the stuff that doctors have to do in that case, and then she walks out. She walks by the nurse's station. Nurse is on the phone. She says, oh, Dr. Kubler-Ross, this call actually is for you, and it's from the other hospital, letting her know that the brother had died about an hour before. So at the time that her patient came, regained consciousness, his brother was already with his mother in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. He knew it, but nobody else did at the hospital yet.
Wow.
So there are a lot of cases of like that, and cases where people just learn information, like Mary Neal knowing that her son was going to pass. She thought before his 18th birthday, and it actually ended up happening shortly after his 18th birthday.
It is also I've had people come in talking about, I saw the assassination attempt.
Yes.
I see the future. I see this president being elected. I see that economic downfall. I see the pandemic.
Right.
I saw all there's a lot of that happens on the other side,
mm-hmm.
meaning that they were shown these in the other
mm-hmm.
side, but also after they get back, they have this thinning of the veil where they're being sent these ideas and messages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there can still be access to knowledge of the future and the past.
I always tell people because I've heard this from so many people on the other side, is that when they're there, they have all knowledge instantly. Whatever they ever wanted to know about quantum physics, I instantly understand it.
Yeah.
And they have all this understanding of, I understand how the whole thing works now. This is fantastic. But when they come back down, they can't remember. They might have a snippet or two here or there. They might have some teachings here or there. But the generalized amount of information, they just can't bring it down. And I always tell people, well, because we run a 5.5-inch floppy down here.
Yeah.
And that's quantum computing up there.
Right, exactly right. Yeah.
So it's that big of a vast, if not larger of a vast, but that's as an example.
Yeah. And sometimes people are even told, like, you're going to have this experience of knowing everything,
but it's going to go
away. You're not going to be able to remember it when you go back.
Because the brain can't really comprehend that.
Yeah,
it can't. It's just not, the hardware's not there.
Yeah.
It's not, we're a 5-inch floppy.
Yeah.
Now, one area of a near-death experience that have always fascinated me is that most are very positive.
Mm-hmm.
Most are a very positive,
mm-hmm.
loving
mm-hmm.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
There's no judgment on the other side, other than whatever you judge yourself while going through a life review or something along those lines. But there is a small percentage in my research mm-hmm. that are negative mm-hmm. and somewhat hellish mm-hmm. sometimes. Mm-hmm. What is your experience with those? Because mm-hmm. people are like, you see, there is a hell. And then most of those people that I've spoken to always say, I went through that because that was my belief system, that I needed to go through that. What is your experience with
Yeah. Well, so I'm just as a little prelude, I'm going to be using the words pleasurable and distressing.
Fair enough.
Because even distressing experiences usually eventually bring about positive after effects. And conversely, pleasurable experiences can be very disruptive to people's lives and be quote unquote negative, at least in the short term.
When they come back, you mean?
Yes, right. So, pleasurable experiences, as you said, dominated by feelings of peace, joy, love, and those sorts of things. Distressing experiences dominated by feelings such as terror, horror, isolation, that sort of thing. And there's been research about distressing NDEs, so I can speak to the results of the research. And we know that there are at least 3 types of distressing NDEs. The most commonly reported isn't that bad in the sense that it has the same features as a pleasurable NDE, but for some reason the person seems to be resisting, and that's creating negativity. Like they're moving rapidly through a tunnel, but they don't want to be moving rapidly through a tunnel. They're like digging in their heels, and it's making the experience unpleasant.
Resistance.
And resistance seems to be a factor in many of those cases. And we also know that in some cases, the person decides to just like relax and let it happen. And when it does, then it turns completely pleasurable. So when they let go of the resistance, it's good. So that's what's most commonly reported. Next most common are experiences of being absolutely alone forever. So it's an experience of absolute eternal isolation where there is complete clarity and consciousness of being absolutely alone forever. And it is a particular kind of hell because there is nothing and no hope of anything. And the first distressing NDE I ever heard directly from a person was of this type. And it was in an IANDS support group. And so the guy's telling that he went through some kind of medical crisis, and he was out in an absolute dark void, totally hyper aware that he was absolutely alone forever. And he said it was horrifying. And then it was over. He was back in his body. But he said that had been about 5 years before. And in the 5 years, he had, of course, reflected on this a lot. And what he realized was that he had been raised in a really abusive family. And the best thing he could do was to be as invisible as possible. If nobody notices you, then nobody can abuse you. So he developed an approach to life, just that he wanted to be left alone. And he took that mode of operation into when he went to school, when he grew up. He was in a kind of a job where he worked alone and had very little contact with other people. And what he said was that he realized that in his NDE, he got what he had been searching for all his life. He was left alone. And only in that experience did he realize that that really wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was safe connection. And he said after that discovery, he reoriented his entire life. He learned, instead of putting everybody on the untrustworthy end of the spectrum, that people range, and he would find people that were relatively more trustworthy. He learned how to disclose things about himself, to make connections with other people, how to listen to other people, to make connections. And he said, today I am a different person than I was 5 years ago. And he said, nothing short of that experience would have transformed me, because he was just locked in this worldview that nothing was safe and his only safety was to be left alone. So it's an example of one of the books that was written about distressing NDEs was called Blessings in Disguise, and that a lot of people after a distressing NDE end up feeling very grateful for it, because nothing short of that could have helped them in a kind of spiritual course correction. Now, that isn't true for absolutely everybody, but for a lot of people, it is true. And some people just continue to go through life struggling with the existential message of their distressing NDE, such as one of probably the leading researcher of distressing NDEs is Nancy Evans Bush, and she's written 2 or 3 books on it. She had one herself. She's a minister, and she had a distressing NDE in which I don't remember exactly, but she was out in space. There were these beings that were flipping back and forth, that somehow that was conveying to her that nothing was real, that she wasn't real, the life she'd had wasn't real, and she was convinced. And it was a horrible, like if nothing is real, then what's the point of anything?
Right.
And so she came back, and she's really just been processing that, for all these years. And she's come to some ultimate optimistic perspective, but it's just taken a long, long time. And so that's the isolation ones, or the second. And then the least frequently reported, but reported, are involving torment of some kind. And I've only heard one case that involved actual fire, like fire and brimstone kind of thing.
Yeah, I've never heard of fire. I've heard of demons. I've heard of dark entities.
Yes.
It rings back to the movie Ghost.
Yeah.
Those dark shadow creatures.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, I know the writer Bruce, he's been on the show of Ghost. And he's wonderful. And he's a Tibetan meditator now. And but he had the craziest psychedelic experience that he went to the edge of the universe, met God, and came back. And then you could start seeing all the movies. He wrote Jacob's Ladder. He wrote so many of these movies. And Ghost is one of the seminal projects.
Yes.
But he got it right, because those creatures are kind of what I've been hearing in some of these distressing ones.
Right.
But fire and brimstone is never, there's never been a devil poking.
Yeah.
It's always experiential.
Yes.
Wasteland.
Yeah.
Like a burnt down city and, kind of vibe. Is that kind of what you've been hearing as well?
Yeah. And like I said, I've only come across one that involved actual fire. Everybody else, it was torment by entities of some kind. And like Howard Storm, have you interviewed him?
I have not ever interviewed him. He's very famous.
But he's famous, and his NDE is available online if people want to see it. Okay. And he was an atheist and had was really tormented in ways that were profoundly traumatic. And that is still difficult for him to talk about. And he's even said that he's never described some of the things that he experienced, because it's just too horrible, and he doesn't want to relive it in the description. So, and he also eventually, had a profoundly pleasurable experience. So he left that. And there also is another form, like Matthew Davell had an NDE in which, in part of it, he was free falling through space. He landed on what he said was sort of like a tennis court material, and he split into 4 hymns. One was him over here watching, and the other 3 hymns were experiencing encounters with people from the past who he had hurt, encounters with people in his current life who were affected by his death, and this happened during suicide, but should not be associated with because we know there's no relationship between the nature of the NDE and the physical circumstances of it. But in his particular case, he had attempted suicide, and then in the future, seeing how his suicide was going to affect people. So he said in the first case, he would. And he said this went on for 3 days and 3 nights with no let up. And this him over here was just writhing in agony over what the other 3 hymns were experiencing. So the first one, he said, for example, he'd be standing there and someone from his past would appear and come up and bump his chest, which he later said was kind of like a heart chakra connection. And he would relive how he had hurt that person, and he experienced being them and receiving what he had, sent to them. And it was agonizing. And he also saw how what he had done to them had reverberated through their life and created pain for other people. So it was just this awful experience. In the present one, he saw how his mother would respond when she got the news that he had killed himself. And in the future, he saw his daughter, who at the time was a baby, he saw her on her graduation day sitting in her room crying because here was another event that her father wasn't there to watch. Eventually what happened was that he had a near-death experience before when he was a preteen, in which he had met Jesus, and Jesus had told him it was time to go back and finish his work. And as a 11-year-old, he's like, what was he talking about? But he remembered that Jesus, and after this 3 days and 3 nights, and he called out to him, and as often happens in distressing NDEs, when the person calls out, and not always, but very often, when they call out, they're rescued. And he said this hand just came out from above, grabbed him, pulled him up, and the minute he left that surface, they all coalesced into him again, and then he had another conversation with Jesus and so forth. So
that's the one thing I've heard from the distressing ones, that they go through a hellish or really rough scenario, but they always come out of it. They don't and we're back.
Yeah.
They don't leave there and come back into their body, and that's the only experience they have.
Yeah.
Is that from your case as well, or have you heard of?
Like that guy who had the void experience, that's all he had in his NDE, and he came back. So yeah, I think some people do come back with, but I think it's very rare, and also that. We're getting into why do people even have NDEs?
Get out of my head. I was about to ask you that question.
Yeah.
Why on a soul's journey? What's the purpose of it? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, and this is where, again, I have to clarify that I'm not speaking from research. It's just my personal opinion after all these years, is that they're facilitators of spiritual development. And whereas some people can be facilitated with a pleasurable experience, some people need a distressing experience. And it's just like I've heard, I don't have children, but I've heard people talk about how they have to discipline their children differently. There's the child who all you have to do is look at them and they're straighten up and fly right. And the other one that, you can kick them out of the house and they're still struggling. And so I think that at a spiritual level, there's a wisdom about what's known about what this person needs, and they get what they need. And
like in life.
Yeah, like in life.
Like in life, because I don't know about you, it hasn't been peaches and cream for me the entire ride.
Certainly
So
has
there's
not.
certain things that come in our lives that are negative at the time.
Yes.
Or even distressing at the time or traumatic at the time. But when you look back, you go, oh, okay, I'm who I am because of these events.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I imagine NDEs are the same.
Absolutely.
I've heard from multiple NDErs that the NDEs a lot of times are exit points in the blueprint. So as a soul blueprint, the concept of soul blueprint, you're on the other side before you come down. Then you sit down with a council of light, council of elders, if you will, and okay, in this life I want to be a doctor. My name is Jan. I want to study near-death experiences. I want to bring this out to the world because it needs it at this time in history for humanity, and I really want to do my part in this. And they're like, cool, all right, you're going to have this, this, and this. So you're going to have these mile markers along the way. How you get to those mile markers are up to you. Have fun. But these are things that have to happen. You're going to meet your husband because you guys have business and lessons to learn. You're going to go to this school. You're going to live in this, all that kind of stuff. From my understanding with near-death experiencers is that in that roadmap, there's off-ramps that are put in space just in case things have going awry. Meaning like, you know what, I really want to be a musician this life, Jan. And like you like, I don't want to do NDEs. I saw the Rolling Stones and I want to be a rock star now. And you've gone off the rock star path. Been very difficult, very hard because it's not your life. That's not what you're supposed to. And you can't sing, but you're stubborn and you're going down this road. That's when you have go to a party, you OD, and there's your because you're like, that's your exit point. And then they go through this, you go to the other side and go, Jan, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. You wanted this path. You're going down this path. Do you want to leave this life and start again? Or do you want to get on the path you agreed on? Is anything I say make sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of NDErs would agree that that's kind of what's going on.
Yeah, it's kind of like I don't know about you.
Course correction.
A course correction, because as we walk through life, there's occasionally, when we're going off the path, there's a whisper, there's a tap, there's a shove. Eventually a sledgehammer comes and hits you in the head, or a car rear ends you or T-bones you to wake you up. Yeah. There has to be some event to just go, no, this is not you. This is not where you need to go.
Right.
And NDEs is the ultimate version of that. Time coming back is one of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you, you and I are talking about NDEs because we both are fairly experienced with them. Can you explain to someone who's never heard, this might be their very first time listening to any NDE content, because they're curious. Can you just go through a typical, and I know that's hard to say, but an NDE that has those elements that are now kind of typical or historical in the research that everyone generally has a version of, or at least one or two of those elements in their NDE?
That's right. And you just said that really well, because there's this kind of model NDE, but nobody has, I don't know about nobody, but it's very rare to find somebody who has all those elements. But if you look at hundreds of NDEs, you see this pattern of experiences. So typically the person is in a medical crisis, although we now know that what are called near-death experiences can happen under a variety of extreme circumstances. And maybe the best facilitator is a near-death episode, but it's not the only one.
So you mean like psychedelics or plant medicine can take you to those places maybe?
Yeah. Personally, I believe that psychedelics can facilitate these experiences, but that hasn't been really confirmed exactly through research. But extreme anger. I heard one guy came to an IANDS conference. He was in the midst of this intense, violent, not physically, but verbally violent argument with his girlfriend. He was just consumed with jealousy. And in the midst of it, he suddenly was out of his body, communing with this spiritual entity. And he said a conversation that went on for a few hours, and during which he got a completely different perspective, came back to his body and finished the sentence he had started. So Earth time and that time are not the same.
Of course.
And
would that be an OBE though? Would that be an out of body experience?
Well, he didn't experience it as an in the sense that his spirit was out of his body, yes, but he didn't. But this is where the terminology gets complicated.
Funky.
I think people usually think of an out-of-body experience as observing the material world. And so, yes, he was out of his, and I say that near-death experiences are extended out-of-body experiences that include perception of the material world and perception and interaction with beings and environments not of the material world.
Fair enough.
So, yeah. So anyway, he comes back. He said the way he finished the sentence was very different than the way he would have finished it had it not been for that experience. And he said from that point forward, their interaction just completely was completely different. So he was not physically near death. He was maybe near egoic death, or I don't know how to explain. He was just in the extreme jealousy. And people have had this experience when they're extremely peaceful. They might be, meditating and have a quote-unquote near-death experience, but they're not physically near-death. So we still are using the term near-death experience because that's the term that has all the research and everything behind it. But we qualify that to say that you don't need to be near-death physically to have a near-death experience.
I've heard of a near-death-like experience.
And yes,
NDLE.
NDLE. And just to know that research shows that those experiences are indistinguishable from NDEs that occur during medical crises. So again, the medical crisis may be the single best facilitator, but the most frequent facilitator, but certainly not the only one. Okay, so typically, as I said, persons in some kind of crisis, they typically will first leave their body. Now, some people they perceive themselves leaving their body. Some people are just suddenly out of their body and become conscious out of their body. And my hand is up here because usually they find their consciousness above the scene of the physical situation, looking down. At the same time, they have, and one of the things from my research is we now know that they have what I call normal plus perception. So red looks like red. If you're in your body or out of your body, if it's red, it's going to look red. People out of their body can read. At least half of people say they're sure that they could. And so all those perceptions, but they also perceive globally. So like right now, I can't see my fingers, but if I were out of my body, I would be able to.
Even though there's no eyes there.
Yeah, there are no eyes there. They can both see and see through solid objects like walls. They can hear things that are happening at a very great distance from their physical body. So it's normal perception plus all these other abilities. And movement occurs at the speed of thought. So if the person thinks of something, zoom, they're there, and they can perceive any things at very far distances from their body. So there's that physical perceiving the material world, and then at some point they might start to feel themselves rising. They might see off to their left, behind them, a light that they start moving toward. But there's some kind of movement, and it might be eventually through the tunnel, like we talked about, and on the other side of that movement is the transmaterial world, where they will perceive and interact with environments and entities that are not physical. So they might find themselves in a preternatural environment where every blade of grass has consciousness or emanates light. They see colors like they say don't exist on Earth. They hear music like they never heard on Earth, and they meet entities. It might be deceased loved ones. It might be spiritual entities of another sort that they may or may not label spiritual. But I prefer just the term transmaterial. They're but some people perceive them as spiritual. Some of these entities they might recognize, some they don't recognize. Even if they don't recognize them, they still might have this sense of familiarity, like this person and this entity and I know each other like from forever. But sometimes they're identifiable, like Jesus or Buddha, Mary, Buddha. Sure. Yeah, exactly. So, usually it's during the transmaterial aspect that the person has a life review, where they review and simultaneously re-experience and simultaneously observe from a kind of third-person perspective, typically every moment of their life, and recall things that they had, in normal life, like completely forgotten about, but also experience being on the receiving end of their actions. And probably this is the most impactful thing from an NDE is to know that when I do, it's not just to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. Mm-hmm. It's that when I do unto you, I do unto me. Mm-hmm. And that is, like a guiding lesson in life. And so then, and in the life review, the people report that they don't feel judged, but right. they feel absolutely known and understood, but not judged. People judge themselves, are disappointed in their own behavior, but feel just absolutely supported and just unconditionally loved. Mm-hmm. And they say that the love that they experience is beyond anything that could possibly happen at an earthly level. And the knowing, the knowledge, as you mentioned before, is beyond any earthly capacity for comprehension. So there are these very unearthly things that happen. And then eventually the person returns to their body. They might, as we talked about, be given a choice, maybe not. Some people actually experience themselves returning to their body. Some are just suddenly back in their body, like I'm back, and mm-hmm. And don't have a sense of how they. And I'll just say one other thing that about leaving and returning to the body. People do it all different ways. Mm-hmm. I've heard, through the navel, through the just lift out of the whole body, through the top of the head. Sure. It can just be.
Or you just wake up and you're there.
Yeah, or you just wake up and you're there. And the same thing with returning. That people return through different parts of the body and in different ways. So yeah.
Have you also come across the point of no return?
Yes, well, that's a good point, that often people get to a point in their NDE where they perceive that if they go further, they're not going back to earthly life.
Like they could see their relatives on
the other side. And
on the distant field or something, and they want to go, but they're like, if you pass this threshold, right, you're done.
Right. Yeah, really.
And a lot of times it's not even just from my understanding, it's not like an invisible line. No. There's usually a window, a door, a path.
A river. Yes. It could be a mountain valley. There's some barrier or something that would need to be crossed. Mm-hmm.
And then there's, and for everybody who has pets, animals.
Yes.
All sorts, not just dogs and cats, but every animal that meant something to you.
Right.
Is there waiting for you.
Yes. And sometimes even not. Like I've heard people say that they encountered horses and had telepathic communication with the horse, and horses were never part of their life before. In this life, in their physical life, but often people do meet deceased pets. And animals that were important to them in their physical life.
I've also heard of the beautiful music.
Yeah.
Beautiful sounds.
Yeah.
The vibrant colors that don't exist here.
Yeah.
As well is another thing that you can almost feel everything. So every blade of grass, you are feeling it.
Yes.
Every brisk wind that goes by.
Yeah.
And when I say brisk wind, it's from, again, my understanding is this reality, this construct that we're in, is a reflection of the other side. It is. It takes a lot of those elements, the trees, the grass, the animals, these kind of things. That they're kind of a reflection.
Yes, and that as we talked about before, people often bring their earthly perceptions and project them into the afterlife. And Mary, I don't know if Mary Neal talked about this when you interviewed her, but there was one point in her NDE where she's walking along in this beautiful environment with this spiritual entity, and she looks behind her and she realizes that whenever they get past a certain point, it just disappears.
It's like it's rendering. It's like a video game. It only renders what you see, not the entire world, because if not, you couldn't run the planet.
And that's she communicates like what's going on, and that's what her spirit guide says. Well, we're rendering this so to help you feel more comfortable and make your adjustment here. It is amazing. So, and there's one other thing that communication in the transmaterial domain is telepathic.
Yeah, completely.
And it seems to be kind of instantaneous. Like, I don't have to pose my question and wait for your
it's
response.
Just a knowing.
It's, I have this question and you know it and you respond to it immediately. So there's, it sounds very rapid, like would be kind of overwhelming.
For 5.5 inch floppy.
Right, exactly. But yeah, it's fine there.
So I have to ask you, there's, the universe is a fairly large place.
Mm-hmm.
We are on one planet. But there is now proof out there that there is billions of Earth-like planets that we can even see, and that's only a small percentage. So it's almost an infinite amount of other realities, other planets. In any of the NDEs, have there been non-human entities on the other side that they met there, in a past life or anything like that? I don't want to put the tinfoil hat on, but it is something that is discussed, and I've heard people talk about, I've met my spirit guide, not spirit guides, but my spirit guides, but also my council of elders that we've talked about, that there are members there that have never been on Earth.
Yes.
So what is your experience with that?
Yeah, just what you said, that some NDErs say that some entities they know were previously human, and some they know or are told that they never lived a human existence. And recently, some NDErs have talked about one gal who, she said in her first NDE, she actually met aliens and there was a spaceship behind them. Mm-hmm. So it
happens.
Yeah, it happens. Right.
It happens. So it is part of the conversation.
Yeah.
It's not often.
No, right.
It's not often, but it is part of the conversation.
Right.
And I guess is needed for that soul. It's what is needed in that experience.
Right. Yeah.
Jan, I'm going to ask you a few questions, ask all my guests.
Okay.
What is your definition of living a fulfilled life?
I think it's having a sense of what my purpose is and fulfilling it. So a combination of being guided and making choices that seem to fulfill a higher purpose.
If you had a chance to go back in time and talk to little Janice, what advice would you give her?
Oh, it gets better. Yeah. And yet, like we were saying, that ignorance was important for processes that unfolded in my life and helped me be who I am today. So yeah, I think everything has been, maybe that really would be the better, is just to, you're good. It's good.
It's going to be all right.
Yeah, it's going to be all right. Just hang in there. Yeah.
How do you define God or source?
It is the all that is. About a year and a half ago, I did 3 ketamine-assisted therapy sessions for personal growth.
Nice.
Yeah,
wow.
It was nice. Oh, so life-changing.
That's another episode.
Yeah. And in one of them, I'll just tell you what do we have time for me to say a little bit? Okay. So I'm out in space. I'm not connected to my body anymore. I'm out in space, and there's a darkness over here. And I said to my therapist, Julie, I'm suspended outside of darkness. So I was just hanging there, and that was fine. But at some point, I moved into the darkness. And as I moved deeper and deeper, I said to Julie repeatedly, I'm losing my sense of myself. And then at one point I said, I'm not me anymore. Now that doesn't really make sense. Experientially, it made perfect sense. Mm-hmm. I was not me anymore. I actually tried to remember how I got here, and I could not remember who I was. Mm. And I had no concept of Jan or that identity at all. And I said to Julie, I'm one with the darkness that is nothing/everything. I was in this darkness that was the pregnant void, the source of everything before it manifests into phenomena. And it was an experience of absolute peace, a very crystal clear awareness. There was nobody, because nothing had manifested yet. So, and I was still a center of consciousness, and also, I have to say, and also immediately I have to say, and part of everything. So it's not like I was just me. I wasn't me. I wasn't me anymore. So that for me was God. That's all that is. It's the everything before it manifests into anything.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing that with me.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
Where can people find out more about you and the amazing work you're doing to awaken this planet?
Well, I do have a website, janholden.com, so people can go there. And, you know, I'm on LinkedIn and other for people who are into that sort of thing.
And you work with IANDS as well, of course.
I'm currently serving as president of IANDS, and I highly recommend people interested in NDEs to go to the IANDS.org website.
And what does that stand for everybody?
International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you have any parting messages for the audience?
Well, for me, probably the most important thing that comes from near-death experiences is the message that a lot of experiencers, not everybody, but a lot of them say, which is that each of our lives on Earth has purpose. Purpose is to advance in our capacity to love and also to acquire knowledge, like loving and learning, but loving is definitely the first one. That's really our purpose as we move through every moment of our lives and interact with each other and make decisions at every level, from the personal to the global, through organizations and governments and all that. And just that if love, which I define as investment in the well-being of, if all of us were invested in the well-being of each other, the world would be such a different place. So that's I think the most important thing of all of this. I
appreciate that. That's such beautifully said. I appreciate you coming down here, sharing your knowledge and wisdom with all of us and experience. And I appreciate you and everything you're doing to awaken this planet. So thank you again, Jan.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.